Speaker. So Jason Lahman is a member that we're proud to have him as a member of the Morbid Anatomy community. He has lectured and taught for us many times and hopefully will continue to do so. He is also a visual artist and cultural historian. He holds a master's degree in the history of science and technology and has taught a variety of classes on subjects including a cultural history of robots and a history of fairies here at Morbid Anatomy. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to today's speaker. And at the end, if you can hold your questions till then and then share them in the Q&A or the chat, I will share them with him. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and turn my video off and say welcome, Jason, and all of you.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank you so much for coming, and I'm really, really excited to be with you today. I have loved the story of Salome and many of its iterations for many, many years, and I'm sure that's true for a lot of you. And so a few months ago, I started thinking, well, actually last year, I started thinking about just sort of the larger view, right? Like, why is this story so persistent? But then as a film fan, I started to go through all of the different film versions of it that I knew. And as I started to do more research, it became sort of astounding. How many are there here? They just went on and on and on. Not to mention all of the references to Salome that pop up in horror films, that pop up in comedies, television. It's just sort of extraordinary how something that really is kind of a minor story in the Bible over the last 2,000 years has morphed into a really, really important cultural image. This image of this beautiful young girl who is sometimes seen as a temptress, sometimes seen, as a victim, sometimes seen as this sort of otherworldly expression of something very dark or something to be desired. So I thought, why not? Let's put together a talk on the history of Salome. And so though this is going to be a talk that is going to be focusing on all of the cinematic representations, and there are many of them over the last 100 and almost 120 years now, in order to really understand, I think, where these come from, we have to understand the larger historical contexts, plural, for the figure of Salome in the Western imagination. And so without further ado, let's jump in. So we're going to really be talking about sort of like where this story comes from, how it changes over time, and then how it's used in different periods of times as a vehicle for a lot of different uses. So let's talk about Salome as sort of something that's kind of an obsession. I'm calling this sort of a brief history of an obsession in Western consciousness. So we're going to be talking about the biblical lore, the biblical sources. We're going to be talking about visual arts. We're going to be talking about, of course, the performing arts, because the central act of Salome is this dance that she does. And that's reflected not only in representations of the dance, but very often dancers or dance elements are being used in works of art to convey the meanings or the feelings of the story, right? And then I want to talk about style because, particularly in the last 150 years, the way that Salome is represented seems to be interconnected with stylistic changes in the arts, and very often in the way that avant-garde art is sort of pushing at the edges of culture. So style, the way that Salome is portrayed, and the way that the story is actually conveyed has a lot to do with the style of the time, the concerns of the time, the visual aspects that are prominent in a given time and place. And then, of course, we're going to be talking about the symbolism, because, of course, the story is it's incredibly ambiguous in certain ways. I mean, depending on who's telling it, certain elements of it are emphasized, others are sort of repressed. And so the meanings of the story, but also the repetition of symbols, are something to really pay attention to. So these are some of the sort of the key elements that I want us to keep in mind as we think about this sort of this story that seems to be what I would call kind of a Western obsession. So as I've said, the figure and the drama of Salome act as both a historical key and, as I've said, also as a stylistic touchstone. The subject is perfect for both experiments in style and in pushing against social limits. So from about 1880 to 1930, this is a very tumultuous 50 years, particularly if we're thinking about Western arts. And that's also when the story of Salome, as we now know it, really, really comes to the fore and becomes popularly known. It leaves sort of the esoteric realm, of poets and the elites and really enters the mainstream through the stage, and then also, as we'll see, through cinema, right? And so once that occurs, sort of from the 1930s onward, the rest of the 20th century really consistently uses the Salome image and the Salome story for a lot of different purposes, but you see it over and over and over again. The French artist Georges Antoine Rochegros painted this story many, many times, and he painted it in a variety of styles. And he's one of these really interesting characters who lives at sort of the Belle Epoque era, right? So 19th century Romanticism, sort of high imperialism is coming to meet what we're going to see as more of avant-garde modernism. And so he's painting Salome sometimes in a very, very academic style, as you can see on the right side here, highly polished. And then if you look on the left, you also see the image of Salome starting to become more fauve-like, right? But pointillistic, post-impressionistic, right? And that's something that I want to sort of keep in mind when we're talking about how Salome is migrating across periods of time. So let's talk about the four main characters in the basic Salome story. We have Salome, right? The young femme fatale. We have her stepfather, also her half uncle. We're going to talk about this very twisted family in just a minute. Herod Antipas, who is the son of the first Herod, the one who commits the massacre of the innocents in the Bible, right? And then there is Salome's mother, Herodias, which is basically the female form of Herod, who has been married to Herod Antipas's brother, right? So Salome is not only the stepdaughter of Herod Antipas, she's his half niece. It's going to get even a little more twisted here when we start talking about this family tree. So there's that family, the Herodian family. And then there's St. John the Baptist, who is a distant cousin of Jesus. So let's sort of talk a little bit about sort of the histories of these two families, sort of the families of Christ and then the family of the Herodians. Before we do that, though, I just want to talk about the references where this comes from biblically. So there in the Christian Bible, in the New Testament, there are three references to Salome, and she's not named Salome. She's named that later on. But these three references are from the synoptical gospels. They're from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I'm going to read you a section from the book of Matthew because it's the longer one. And then I just want to talk a little bit about where that sits in relationship to the other two, and then some of the other historical texts of the time. So this is the basic story. This is where Christians are getting this story from, right? So this is about the death of John the Baptist and what sort of led up to it. When Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, heard about Jesus, he said to his advisors, "This must be John the Baptist raised from the dead. That is, why he can do such miracles." So I just want to say something really quickly. There is this tradition in this period of time that the Messiah, and there's a lot of different theories about who the Messiah is or who he's going to be, there's this sort of theme of reincarnation, which is kind of fascinating, which gets repressed a lot in the early church, but you do find it here. So a lot of people think that John the Baptist is Elijah returned or reincarnated or come back to earth. But then likewise, there's this idea that Jesus, because he can perform these miracles, might be John the Baptist returned to earth, excuse me, or Jesus might be John the Baptist returned to earth. So there's this sort of weird idea that floats around in a lot of the early Christian texts that this holy person who is appearing to save mankind or to work miracles is somehow the same spirit coming back in different form. So there's some confusion here, as you can see from this quote from King Herod. Who is this person? Is this John the Baptist come back from the dead? Herod, so then there's a description of why Herod thinks this. For Herod had arrested and imprisoned John as a favor for his wife Herodias, the former wife of Herod's brother Philip. John had been telling Herod, "It is against God's law for you to marry her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of a riot because all the people believed John was a prophet. But at a birthday party for Herod, Herodias's daughter performed a dance that greatly pleased him, Herod, so he promised with a vow to give her anything she wanted. And as we'll see in the Oscar Wilde play, the line is, "I will give you anything, even if it be up to half my kingdom." As at her mother's urging, the girl said, "I want the head of John the Baptist on a tray." Then the king regretted what he had said, but because of the vow he had made in front of his guests, he issued the necessary orders. So John was beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a tray and given to the girl, who took it to her mother. Later, John's disciples came for his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus what had happened. So this story is recounted in great detail here in the book of Mark and then also in the book of Luke. It is recounted again with slightly different details. But biblical historians will point out that Josephus, the great Jewish historian, also tells this story. And it casts doubt on the order of events here because, based on Josephus's writings, which I believe actually were written before the Gospels, you have an account of John actually living past the death of Jesus. So it's very ambiguous. So as you start to look at the sources, they're telling us different things about who these people are and when the order of events happens. Okay, that's kind of wonky and kind of nerdy getting into the details here as a historian. What's important to know is that the general idea of the death of John the Baptist is in the Bible related to this idea that John is critical of Herodias, Herod's wife, has been saying things against her because she has divorced her husband and she's married his brother, right? So there's this idea that she's an immoral woman. So that's going to come up again and again as the story is interpreted over time, and as later Christian writers and artists are interpreting the story, and as they're using it for their own means. So let's talk about the family trees of Jesus and then also of Herod, because I find this really fascinating. If you start to dig a little deeper, you start to understand that John the Baptist and Jesus of Galilee are actually relatives. And there's a beautiful story, which is referred to in art as the Visitation, where Mary, the Virgin Mary, goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who is pregnant with a child who will become John the Baptist. And there's a really beautiful reference that in I forget which of the Gospels it is, that when Mary embraces her cousin and tells her that she is with child, Mary is with child, the child in Elizabeth's womb, the future John the Baptist, leaps with joy. So there's this idea that even in the womb, John the Baptist knows that the Messiah is coming. So in the Christian tradition, there is this idea that John the Baptist is the one who goes before Christ. And this will come up in different dramatizations of the Salome story. I am not he, but I am he who prepares the way, right? And so very often, if you see images of John the Baptist in Christian art, you will see him pointing up, sometimes even as a child, and he'll be holding a lamb, the Lamb of God. And that's a reference to Christ, right? So this image of the two mothers, one young and one old, Elizabeth is with child with John the Baptist as an older woman. So that's also a part of this sort of miraculousness of the birth of John the Baptist. Elizabeth is beyond childbearing age. So this is an image that you will see over and over in Christian art of the two mothers coming together. It's called the Visitation. And so this is just a genealogical table here showing how different scholars have tried to work out the family relationships between John the Baptist side of the family and Jesus's side of the family. Okay, let's talk about the Herodians and how they're related and entangled. So this is an image of the family tree of Herod the Great, who actually knows Julius Caesar, and who, if you know the movie I, Claudius, he shows up in this because he's raised with Emperor Claudius as a young man. They know each other as children. So Herod is what we would call kind of a puppet ruler. He is Jewish or Semitic. He is fully Romanized and educated by the Romans, and then he rules over Galilee and various parts of the Jewish and Semitic community. So Herod the Great has a number of wives, and Herod the Great is also greatly anxious. And so there's something in the New Testament that's known as the Massacre of the Innocents, because If you know the Christmas story, the three wise men come to him and they tell him why they're visiting, they're looking for the new king. And Herod knows that this is a prophecy, and he fears the coming of the Messiah because he thinks it's going to be an earthly king, right? So he orders the death of all the children. And this is known as the massacre of the innocents, also a theme in art. So hold that for just a second. But looking back at the family tree, I'm going to relate this to the Salome story. Herod the Great, who has all these children killed, trying to kill Jesus when Jesus is a child, he fails, of course, has all of these different wives, and he has various sons by them. There's two main sons, Herod Antipas and Herod Archelaus. Oh, and then there's another one, Herod Philip. There's a lot of little Herods running around. Two of his sons are going to be at one another's throats. And Herodias, the mother of Salome, is going to have Salome by one of them, and then she's going to leave him for his brother, the other Herod. And we're going to come to them in a minute. But they all come out of Herod the Great. So the story of this sort of twisted, noble royal family is interconnected throughout the history of John the Baptist and Jesus, right? It's a really, really interesting image of Herod here in the Massacre of the Innocents, which is done by Giuseppe Arcimboldo in the Renaissance. And if you know Arcimboldo's work, he did those wonderful composite portraits of the seasons where spring is made up of flowers, autumn is made up of fruit. Here he's done a portrait of King Herod, and the face is made up of all of these dead babies because he is the one who orders the massacre of the innocents. So there's grisliness and darkness and corruption woven into the story of this family from the Christian point of view from the very beginning. So that's the background of the Herodian family and the family of Jesus. Let's talk about Salome herself. So remember, she's not named in the Bible. She's the child of Herodias by one of the Herod Juniors. Her mother divorces that Herod and then marries his brother, also named Herod, right? So in Christian art, Salome is she's not named Salome till much later. In fact, she's not named in the Bible. And I just want to point something out. Salome comes from shalom, salam. It means peace. Very common woman's name, just as Mary was a very common name in this period of time. So, in Christian art, the femme fatale aspect of Salome really doesn't start to come into being until the Renaissance. If you see portrayals of Salome in the Middle Ages, she's very often shown in an acrobatic way. It's very, very interesting. So here's an image of her from from a Psalter from the 13th century, and she's shown almost like a contortionist. It's very interesting. She's a tumbler. And you see this over and over again where she almost looks like a complete, almost like an Ouroboros swallowing her own tail. Very, very interesting. Later, as we start to get into this new classicism in the Renaissance, her body, the sensualness of her body, becomes something that becomes more emphasized. And you can also see that just as, the sort of pagan Renaissance starts to come to the fore, right? All of these old texts are being rediscovered that come from the Greco-Roman world. Salome becomes a much more nymph-like character, and her dancing becomes something that it has a much more pagan quality to it. So here's an image from the Renaissance of the dance Salome by Benozzo Gozzoli, and you'll start to see this more and more with this new sensuality in the Renaissance. The body, of course, is returning to Western art in a very new way, and the story of Salome provides a very, very interesting subject for artists to begin celebrating the eroticism of the nubile female form. So a little bit later, you also start to see the head of John the Baptist almost as like a relic. Or, remember, this is happening at a birthday party. So it also becomes this weird sort of fruit, being presented on a tray. You see this over and over again in the Renaissance. And as Renaissance art becomes much more highly refined, the Northern Renaissance is starting to influence the Southern Renaissance and also vice versa. The image of the beautiful Salome with the head being placed on a tray becomes a favorite subject for artists. And then as you start to move on more into the Baroque, the feast itself becomes more highlighted. So we have this wonderful Rubens here, in which she is going up to Herod and she's basically like, surprise, surprise, lifting the lid off of the dish and showing it to Herod. So in Western art, visual arts, the story is becoming more prominent. So we're moving from something that's fairly obscure in the beginning to something that's now entering the mainstream of the sort of visual consciousness or the vocabulary of Western art. Salome is not alone. If we're thinking about powerful women in the Bible who overpower and kill men, and sometimes these are heroines such as Jael or Judith or Queen Esther, but sometimes they're more ambiguous or downright scary. If we're thinking about Delilah and Samson, and then of course Salome. So I just want to very briefly talk about these powerful women who overcome men and how they also provide a really rich source for artists of the Renaissance and the Baroque period. And once you know these stories and you spend some time seeking them out, it becomes quite fascinating how often they are portrayed in art. Jael and Sisera, a story from the Old Testament, very much like Judith and Holofernes. She is a Jewish woman who takes it upon herself to seduce a foreign general, and she gives him some more milk. He falls asleep. There's some ambiguity about whether sexual favors are exchanged or not. Um, it's not explicit. And then she takes a tent peg and she puts it through his head. And so this image of Jael about to strike, or Yael, about to strike the tent peg through the head of Sisera is something that you will find over and over again. And it's very much the same sort of movement, right? If we're thinking about the sword blade coming down on the head of John the Baptist. So here's an image by the great Artemisia Gentileschi of Yael about to kill Sisera. Likewise, even though the Delilah herself does not kill Samson, the cutting of the hair is also an act of taking something away from him, this sort of like castration imagery, right? That his hair is clipped, he loses his strength, Philistines come for him, and that is the end of Samson, right? So again, this idea of the man being overcome by the wiles or the power of a woman who has seduced him starts to play into this sort of image of the woman as the destroyer of a strong man, right? And that can be celebrated if she's like Yael and a hero, or denigrated if she's somebody like Delilah who's bringing down a man of God. I think you can also put Queen Esther into this category because she uses her feminine wiles, right, to get what she needs to get out of her husband, King Ahasuerus, in order to save her people. So Queen Esther, of course, saves the Jewish people from a genocide by inviting the villain Haman to dinner and then denouncing him in front of her husband. And he's then hanged on a tree or the gallows that he has had prepared for her Uncle Mordecai, if you know the story of Purim, right? So I think you can put Queen Esther into this category also of these women who have to, they have to use a different type of power in order to get their man, so to speak, right? And very often that has to do with their beauty and their seductiveness. Of course, Judith and Holofernes, which comes from the apocryphal book of Judith, is portrayed many, many times. And again, if you're raised Protestant, you don't always know these stories because they come from the apocryphal books, which are included in the Catholic Bible, but they're not included in the Protestant Bible, right? But certainly throughout the Renaissance and the Baroque period, the beheading of Holofernes by Judith, who like Queen Esther is a Jewish heroine, or like Yael, is portrayed over and over again by Caravaggio and also Artemisia Gentileschi. And very often you have her maid standing beside her with the sack ready to get the head, right? I thought this is really interesting. I want to bring this up again about names. I'm kind of an etymology nerd, and when I teach history, I very often like to play with etymology. This is new information for me, so I wanted to share it with you. Where does the name Herod come from? And Herodias is the female form of Herod. It's from the Greek, Herodes, and it could possibly mean, or probably means, the song of the hero, from hero and ode, right? So hero and Herodias, it's a title. And I want to point something out, that the name Salome is not attributed to the daughter in this story until several centuries later. And I'm not exactly sure in what text that is. I just know that it's not hooked on there for many, many centuries. And what's interesting is there's some confusion back and forth in various texts, and even in later versions of this story, where the daughter who does the dancing is actually also called Herodias. So in thinking about the name Herodias and its long tradition in Western culture, I want to bring up this is a total sort of off the wall side thing, but I just had to include it because I taught the history of fairies last year, and this comes up when we talk about the histories of fairies and witches. There is a tradition in folklore, mostly in Southern Europe, of a woman who rides through the night, sort of as the queen of the witches, and she is known as Aradia or Herodias. And in the early modern period during the Inquisition, when a lot of these women and sometimes men are being tried as witches, and they are talking about taking these night flights, the queen of the night who leads them through the sky towards the Sabbat is sometimes called Diana. Occasionally she's called Salome, but very often she's called Aradia or Herodias. What the hell? Where is this coming from? Two theories about this. One is that the educated elites who are running the Inquisition are have this idea, right, that this wicked woman from the Bible is somehow connected to this wicked woman who's leading these pagan people through the night sky, right? But there's also some etymological connection, possibly with another deity that might have this name. That's getting a little bit off into the weeds, but I wanted to bring it up because I don't think there's a direct line from the Herodias of the Bible to this character down through the centuries, but later there's an amalgamation. And I want to bring this up because I think this is really interesting. There's a book that's discovered that comes to light in the 1880s, 1890s. There is an Anglo-American scholar who puts together a book called Aradia, or the Gospel of Witches. He claims that it's given to him by this Italian woman who is a witch who follows this folk religion, and they worship a female deity called Aradia. Ronald Hutton is a brilliant scholar, and I would urge all of you to get his new book, Queens of the Wild, if you're interested, or just watch his talks on YouTube. He's the real deal. But he has, I think, effectively argued for the last couple of decades that a lot of these medieval sort of witch goddesses aren't necessarily pagan survivals, but they're pagan recreations in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. So Christian people who are not elite are cobbling together and creating things that come out of their own folkloric traditions and that they are gleaning from the Bible stories that they've heard. And Aradia, Herodias, Salome is one of these characters that seems to pop up both in the Inquisition records and also in sort of the folkloric tradition. So I wanted to put that out there. I think that's a really, really interesting thing. So the Salome story, the Herodias story, has these other really weird sort of roots that seem to connect it to a deep sort of pagan folkloric tradition. So back to our Salome. What is this very, very strange thing of Salome dancing? Well, it's in the Bible, of course, but Salome, as we know her, is an Orientalist thing. Salome, as the dancing, nubile, seductive stripper, if you will, is coming out of a French, English, and later American tradition of Orientalism. And if you're thinking about the 19th century, you have to think about, of course, the imperialism of the time, right? So much of archaeology, of visual culture, is connected to all of the imperial projects of France, the United States, and England. So, as we'll see in a minute, the image of the harem, the image of the Oriental woman, the non Western woman, is being pulled in and utilized in all kinds of ways across the arts, as an erotic image, as a screen, if you will, to project repressed things onto, and also as a way to invent new ways of thinking through a lot of the exciting things that people want to experiment with in the arts. So just two images for you here, coming out of the sort of French academic, tradition, which is really verging on kitsch, of this very pale white woman dancing in the harem. There's a lot of colorism going on here, and I don't have time to talk about sort of the racialism of Salome, but that's a whole other discussion, which is really, really fascinating, tied into the racism of the time and the Orientalism of the time. You can see it whenever you're looking at a representation of Salome, for sure. Salome as the femme fatale, as the destroyer, is very much a part of the 19th century femme fatale project among the decadents in France and also in England and in many other parts of Europe. If you don't know, I'm sure many of you know this book already, but if you don't, Bram Dijkstra's Idols of Perversity really is the seminal text that really goes over this, right? So fantasies of feminine evil in fin de siècle culture. And it takes its name from this fabulous painting by Jean Delville, The Idol of Perversity. And as we'll see, the image of Salome as this sort of dancing, really kind of goddess, really is grounded in the visual culture of the femme fatale of this period of time, right? An artist I would like all of you to know about. He's sort of a late romantic. He's one of the last of the decadents. He dies actually in 1971, but he creates his major body of work in the very early 20th century. Is Massa, Gustav Adolf Massa. And if you ever find yourself in Nice on the French Riviera, that's where all of these things are stored and displayed, because he was the head of that museum, as his father was before him. And I had the great privilege last year of visiting this museum and getting to spend a whole day with many of these images. So I just want to put a few of them up here. She, the siren, and then he did many, many versions of Salome, which are some of the creepiest things you'll ever see, because there's this really, really strong emphasis sort of placed on sort of the youth of Salome, but also her murderousness. And then in his images of the femme fatale, where he brings in images of the chimera and images of the Sphinx, he's very often also merging it with the atrocities that are taking place in Europe at the time. So you'll see images of the First World War, like in She here. You have this very buxom, nude female Sphinx sitting on this mountain of war dead. So that's another thing that I actually want to point out to you, that so much of the violence that's taking place in Europe in the 19th and the 20th century is also being, I think, funneled into the story of Salome as a way to sort of express grief and anxiety. Because, if you think about it, Christian Victorian culture is very much an attempt to civilize and repress and, gird in everything. And the decadent movement, with all of its attendant, images of Orientalism and the femme fatale, is a way of these artists trying to express all of this sort of repressed stuff, right? So you'll see that over and over again in the images of Salome. The other thing I want to point out, which I think is really interesting, is that in the 19th century in Europe, there is a resurgence in mystical Catholicism. So in the 18th century, where you have the Enlightenment, you have like the French Revolution, I want us to be thinking about, there is this Enlightenment project about trying to liberate government and society from the grip of the Catholic Church. But what we also have to remember is that is an elite project in many ways. And a lot of the social reformers are coming from the upper classes or the high bourgeoisie. And what doesn't often get emphasized is that the common people are not always in alignment with this revolutionary modernizing attitude. And that's also why later on, when we come to movements of fascism, this is very often a connection between elites in the church and the aristocracy and the working classes. And this is particularly confusing to Americans, but in Europe, it makes a whole lot of sense because the ancient tradition of folkloric Catholicism, and particularly of the connection to Mary, is very, very deeply rooted into the people, right? So in the 19th century, you have a resurgent Catholicism, you have a resurgent sort of Mariolatry, and there are a lot of artists who kind of buy into this too, including the decadents. And it's very odd. You have people like Oscar Wilde, later people like Edith Sitwell, Swinburne, a lot of these decadent avant-garde artists who are converting to Catholicism. It's like, well, what gives? Well, they're tying themselves into another tradition of Catholicism, which is the mystical, romantic side of it. And if you look at images of Salome, particularly in the 19th century, with the glowing head of John the Baptist, the image of Salome, you kind of start to get something that feels a lot like a throwback to people like St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross. The death of John the Baptist and the passion of Salome becomes this almost sacred marriage between the living and the dead. It's very strange. But I think it's really important to point that out. It doesn't come out of nowhere, right? And if you look at particularly images in the work of people like Odilon Redon or Lucien Lévy-Demers, you get a softness, you get a sweetness in this sort of strange image of the severed head and Salome kissing it. Again, I've said this before, Orientalism, looking towards the East, particularly the Levant and North Africa, is in the story of Salome, is hugely related to the massive use of the image of the harem in the 19th century, two images by Delacroix and also of Ang. And we're treading a fine line here, right, between sort of academicism and pornography or eroticism. The female body is on display for the male gaze, of course, as it is in the harem for the sultan or whoever owns the harem, right? Because the only people who are attendant upon the women in the harem are eunuchs and the female attendants. So these images are also very much about the male gaze, and they are very much being recreated in alignment with this idea of the scene, right? That's being made for an elite sort of, Western male gaze. And that's very much a part of the story of Salome optically. Something else that I wanted to point out, this idea of the veils, right? There's no reference to the veils in the Bible, and they're not numbered at 7. I don't believe until Wilde. I think he's the one who puts that number, the Dance of the Seven Veils, right? But the veiled image of the woman has a very, very strong history in Western art from the late Renaissance Baroque period up through the Romantic period. I want to point out two references. One is this idea of nature as a veiled goddess and learning, science, very much a male endeavor if we're thinking about the Western project. You see this in philosophy and scientific texts. Nature, she's giving up her secrets, right, to the learned. So she's being revealed. And there's a poem that's written in the Romantic period about the veiled statue of Isis at Sais, where Isis says, "No man shall lift my veil," right? And in the Romantic period, you get this image over and over again, which is again also part of this sort of eroticizing of the female body, of a beautiful nubile woman being veiled. So not only, and we have references to this going back to the Renaissance with images like of the veiled Christ, right, where it's being done with a male body. But you really, for this new sort of consumption, right, of the sort of elite hetero male gaze, you get this, or anybody who likes to look at a beautiful nude woman, I guess, you start to see this over and over, particularly in the Victorian period. This veiled, archaic, very often buxom female figure in a very, very thin veil is being created for the markets of the elite. So I just wanted to put that up. And it's also showing off the skill of the sculptor, right? So I wanted to put that out there, these sort of visual references to veils and the veiled body, sort of really, sort of proto-striptease, right? Let's really start to talk about Oscar Wilde now, because again, most of the cinematic references that we're going to be looking at really are grounded in Oscar Wilde's play. Oscar Wilde is spending a lot of time in France before he writes Salome. And the story of Salome as a femme fatale and as the subject of the new sort of late romantic decadent works of art in both literature, music, and also the visual arts, is really a big part of sort of Parisian output. So Wilde is a big fan of Huysmans, who writes à rebours, against the grain. And there's lots of descriptions in à rebours of the paintings of Gustave Moreau, but particularly his paintings of Salome. And they're very bejeweled, and they're highly Orientalist. By the way, Gustave Moreau is the teacher of Henri Matisse. So there's this wonderful connection if you're thinking about sort of the harem portraits, harem images, these Orientalist images of Henri Matisse, of Henri Matisse. Bear in mind that Gustave Moreau is his teacher, right? So there's some connection there. So Wilde is reading this. Wilde is also seeing these paintings in Paris, right? Wilde is also certainly knows about the works of Gustave Flaubert, because Flaubert is one of the most famous writers in France. Flaubert writes a short version of this story called Herodias, and that's in his Three Tales. So that's published in 1877. Jules Massenet adapts this as an opera, taking liberties with the story, and it's called the Herodiade. I want to point something out, because when we start talking about the movies, this is really important. In Jules Massenet's opera, Salome is not a femme fatale, and she's not necessarily a victim. She ends up as a victim, but she really plays a prominent role in this with a lot of agency. And I just want to point this out. It's really interesting. And I didn't know this until a few weeks ago when I was doing my research. I've never listened to this whole opera. I think based on a lot of what I've read about it, Massenet for many of us can be a little bit, tedious. And the opera actually, that was a term that was used to describe it at the time by many critics. But I just want to point this out. In this opera, the character of Salome is very sympathetic. She's basically been sent away by Herodias, and she becomes an acolyte of John the Baptist. And she's in love with him, but she's also interested in his ideas of as a social reformer and as a holy man of God. Based on what I've read, I don't think she even does a Dance of the Seven Veils in this opera. But I found it interesting that she is not seen as a femme fatale. She is seen more as a full-fledged character playing a part in the drama and the tragedy of John the Baptist's death. So I just want to say that, because I think that very often, now we think of the story of Salome as being one thing, and the femme fatale, erotic, really disturbing, incestuous aspect of this is what has been played up since the time of Oscar Wilde. But I think if we think about the length of life of this story, I think the story actually can offer a variety of different interpretations. And I think, and hopefully this will be true going forward, it can be mined and utilized in other ways, where Salome is not necessarily a psychopath or a femme fatale, and she's not necessarily a helpless victim. But for our purposes, mostly that's the way she's been portrayed in the last 100 years. So let's jump into Oscar Wilde and talk about why that is. So again, Oscar Wilde becomes fascinated by this character. He's not really known as a playwright at the time. He's known more as a critic. His big successes haven't happened yet. I'm not a Wilde scholar, but this is based on my own reading of this and my own memory right now. I'm going to refer you to a really good lecture on this in just a second. But he's very good friends with the great Sarah Bernhardt. And so he writes this for her, with her in mind, and she reads it and she's very, very excited about doing this in England. So he starts writing it in 1891. It's published in France in 1893, and they are in rehearsals in England with Sarah Bernhardt to get this done. Well, the censor in England comes down like a ton of bricks and says, you're not going to do this. Gives various excuses for why. Fast forward, Salome by Oscar Wilde is not performed on the stage in its entirety until 1931. Just going to set that aside for a second. Here's a beautiful image of Sarah Bernhardt, of course, as Wilde's Salome. And keep in mind that Sarah Bernhardt, if you think about her as this actress, she is utilizing not only the image of the femme fatale, but also the image of really powerful historic women, very often, powerful Eastern queens, Theodora, the Byzantine queen. These are the characters that she's drawing on to create these powerful, archaic women on stage. And then later in life, she's even going to play Hamlet. She's going to play Napoleon's only child, the young Austrian prince on stage. She's really a fascinating character. But Salome is a character that she really does want to embody on stage, doing Wilde, but that is stymied. Um, I've put images, of course, and I'm sure all of you know this if you're fans of Salome, of Aubrey Beardsley's illustrations for the English edition published in 1894. And it is that early Art Nouveau, black and white, highly erotic, truly perverse, forward thinking, these images that are just going to do so much for not only the way that Salome is going to be portrayed on stage, but also for sort of modern style as we know it. Oscar Wilde's Salome, illustrated by Aubrey Beardsley, is a bedrock text for the study of Art Nouveau and decadent literature, and really, if you're thinking about the foundations of modernism in the 20th century, it's really, really important. I would really encourage all of you, if you're interested in the story of the censoring of Oscar Wilde's play, to take the time to listen to the most wonderful lecture by Professor Ruth Robbins. I just watched this a few weeks ago and got so much out of it. She talks about the censorship, and she talks about she will give you a full grounding with dates and with connections for the sort of 20-year period of all the incarnations of Oscar Wilde's Salome. And again, as we start to explore the cinema, we're going to get to that shortly, I promise you, understanding the censorship, the arguments that are being made around Oscar Wilde's Salome in those first decades, you see these things reverberating throughout the cinematic history of Salome. So if you want to go down these rabbit holes and really understand this, I cannot recommend Ruth Robbins' lecture enough, and it's on YouTube. Really marvelous. So I want to talk to you about modern dance. I want to talk to you about Orientalism, and I want to talk to you about archaism, right? The use of the ancient world in early modernism. Salome is both. She is an Oriental, an Eastern princess, and it's also 2,000 years ago. So this image of the beautiful woman from the past, from the East, all of these female pioneers of modern experimental dance are finding a are finding that Salome is a way for them to do this avant-garde liberating work. Ruth St. Denis, Isadora Duncan, and then of course Mata Hari, who is murdered. She's executed in the First World War as a spy. I believe she's Dutch. Um, she dances as Salome. All of them, and I think there's a reason for this, because if you think about the repression of female sexuality in Western Christian culture, where can we find a story so that this female presence can be witnessed on the stage? We have to go east, and we have to go back in time. And so that's if we're talking about cultural appropriation, the cultural appropriation and uses of Salome, even though she's been a part of the Christian story for 2,000 years, but the visual representation has to be appropriated as a way to put her out there. The cultural appropriation is a kind of a container, I would argue, for the repressed, sort of Western female energy. Another case in point, the great Loie Fuller, who is not only a groundbreaking modern dancer, but she holds dozens of patents for special effects on the stage. I'm sure many of you know about Loie Fuller. If you don't, look her up. Fabulous. And, a big woman. And so there's actually criticism of the time. It's like, what is she doing dancing Salome? Well, she uses her bigness on stage. She, wraps herself in these veils, which become like scrims. And she uses her own technological innovations of projection. And the composer Florence Schmidt, really, really interesting character, is going to have an influence on Rite of Spring, sadly becomes a major Nazi sympathizer. That's a whole other story. He creates a whole ballet of Salome for Loie Fuller, and then he's going to adapt that later on. But Loie is like, wait a minute, I'm not going to take all my clothes off, but I'm going to take the idea of veils, and and I'm going to blow it up. And I'm going to create something really ravishing and exciting using this idea of veils and projection. And she does. And that's in the, I think that's around 1908, 1906, 1907, something like that. Another one of these pioneering women who actually dances Salome topless for everybody in London in 1908. So keep in mind, she's a Canadian, by the way. Oscar Wilde is still banned. His Salome is still being banned from being performed in England. But Maud Allan is taking this and she's adapting it as a kind of a pantomime striptease experimental dance using Oscar Wilde's story, his interpretation of Salome, and she's going nude and getting rave reviews. And again, she's able to get away with it. And people in the government are coming to see it, you know, members of the royal court. I mean, it's like she's the toast. Lady Asquith becomes her patron, maybe even her lover. I don't know the details on that, but they have a very close relationship. Puts Maud Allan up, takes her under her wing, and she is the toast of London in 1908. Maud Allan's story is a real trip because her brother is actually hanged for murder in California. And there's a huge libel trial, which I don't have time to get into, in which her family history is dredged up. So Maud Allan is a particularly fascinating, pioneering female entertainer whose story also becomes tabloid fodder a little bit later on in the story. But Ruth Robbins actually goes into Maud Allan's story. Another one of these pioneering women dancers who uses, again, Salome as a way to create this sort of radical female erotic presence on stage and gets away with it. We can kind of say that the first decades of the 20th century, and there's an actual term, is the decade of Salomania. Salome is everywhere. The vision of Salome, which is what Maud Allan's tableau dance is called, inspires other types of music. Florence Ziegfeld Jr. actually uses the Salome story in his Spectacles in New York. Here's an image from 1919 from the Ziegfeld Follies, where the court of Salome and the beheading of John the Baptist is done as a sort of a proto Art Deco tableau. So let's now finally get to the film representations. I just think it's really important for us to understand the whole history of Salome that comes before the film, right? The first filmic representation of Salome is from 1906, and I don't believe we have a clip of this. The Dance of Salome stars someone, this is her real name, Adorée Villani. Villeneuve. Just don't you love it? Supposedly born as Ada Villani. We don't really know who she was. There's conflicting stories about, oh, she was German Jewish. Oh, no, she was Belgian. No, she was French. We've got a lot of images of her. She was tried for obscenity. We have we have the trial records, and we have lots of photographs and lots of fabulous Art Nouveau posters of her. But who Adorée Villani really was, we don't know. But as far as I have been able to tell in my research, she's the first person dancing Salome to be captured on film, and that's in 1906. The opera by Richard Strauss comes out in 1905. That is German, of course, and the libretto is adapted from the Wilde play. Lahman, I think, I forget her first name, adapts it. It's a woman librettist who works with Strauss to adapt this. And I'm sure many of you know the opera, takes the world by storm and is performed in lots of places, of course, including London a few years later. So it's very bizarre. You basically have this great modern opera based on Oscar Wilde's play being performed in London with the ban still on Oscar Wilde's play. And a lot of that, I think, also has to do with Oscar Wilde's trial and conviction. Two of my favorite versions of this, Maria Ewing's is on film. Of course, also Birgit Nielsen. There are many, many, many filmed performances of this opera. Maria Ewing's, of course, is so famous not only because she's so spectacular in it, but because she goes completely naked. And that, I think, is the first time that the other singers have done this. Not a lot, but a number of them have done it. But as far as I know, she's the first one who did it on film. And her husband, Peter Hall, directed it. Really, really interesting story. She's also the mother of our new wonderful director and actress, Rebecca Hall. So another nice connection. So I mentioned Florence Schmidt, who did the thing with Chloe Fuller. He later adapts this for Sergei Diaghilev in the Ballet Russe. And just very quickly, beautiful, beautiful piece of orchestral work with some chorus, easily available online if you want to listen to it. Here's some wonderful images of the costumes. And the main costume for Salome is actually owned by the V&A. And there's a wonderful video on YouTube actually showing this costume up close and talking about why it was so sexy. There's some netting where the breasts are, and the stars over where the nipples would be. So there's this incredible, wonderful use of the body and the sort of peekaboo element of it, along with, just also spectacular materials being used in a really avant-garde way. And the V&A is very fortunate to have so many of these costumes that were created by, for the Ballet Russe. So again, Florence Schmidt's ballet of Salome being performed by the Ballet Russe in 1913. Here's a portrait of Tamara Karsavina, who it was created for. See that wonderful cape. And then an illustration by Georges Barbier showing the dance. So back to film. But that's coming between like the first film in 1906 and the next film in 1910. So we have Ugo Falena. This is about 10 minutes long, coming out of early Italian cinema. It's been beautifully hand tinted. It's about 9 or 10 minutes long, sort of like a stage play being done outside in a garden with, great pantomime gestures. And keep in mind, of course, and some of you probably know this, early Italian cinema is really where it's at for the first sort of biblical spectacle, historical spectacles, right? So much so that even MGM's earliest version of Ben-Hur is going to have lots of elements shot in Italy. One, because they know how to shoot spectacle, and two, it's much cheaper to shoot it there than it is in the United States. So again, Salome, utilizing sort of the Wilde storyline, 1910, and you can watch that on YouTube. Some images. There's the well where John the Baptist is kept. There's John the Baptist has been brought up out of the well, and there she is with her mother Herodias shaking her fist in triumph, and Salome holding the head on a platter. So of course, Theda Bara, 1918. Theodosia Goodman from Ohio, local girl makes good, becomes the first great vamp, right? A Vamp There Was is actually the name of one of her films, right? So becomes, sort of the first femme fatale of the American sort of silent period. This film is lost. A few minutes of it were actually recovered just a few years ago at the Cinematheque somewhere, I think, in Spain. So the 2 minutes that have been recovered, of course, have been put on YouTube for your enjoyment. But, this also caused a lot of consternation in the United States. It was banned in certain areas, of course. That was good for business in certain ways. But, Theda Bara is really an interesting character because she plays Cleopatra, she plays Salome, she's an American Jewish girl, um, but because she's not a blonde and she doesn't look Northern European, she is cast as the exotic other. That's something else I want to mention in the history of anti-Semitism, is that in the 19th, and this continues into the 20th century, remember Salome is a Jewish character. So there's this very strange thing that occurs, and this shows up over and over again in the history of Western Christianity, with stories of Jewish people and biblical characters who very often are Jewish, when Jewish characters are playing them. How much is the Jewishness, in whatever way that is currently being interpreted visually, brought to the fore? And so I just want to point that out. I think that's really interesting. Theda Bara is actually marketed as an Egyptian. She's marketed as an Arab in certain ways. There's this whole idea that Theda Bara is an anagram of Arab death. So the orientalizing of her Jewishness is a part of this as well. So I just want to point that out because this has a long, long history. It's not always right there always to see it, but also Jews in the history of Western anti-Semitism, particularly in the 19th century, are orientalized in many ways. And this has a long history, but this idea of the orientalizing that takes place in the story of Salome isn't just North African or Arab, it's also Jewish, right? So I just want to point that out. It's there in the story of Theda, I think, if you dig around. Okay, in 1920, the story of Salome is adapted as a modern morality play. I have not seen this, but the story is very convoluted, but it's very sort of bringing together the story of Salome in sort of a titillating way, and in also a very moralizing way. And that's something that we have to remember, that particularly in the late Victorian and the 20th century sort of Americanizing of this story, Salome is used in almost a kind of a Sunday school way often, right? And then she's also used as sort of a stripper, right? So it's the story of fallen womanhood. There's sometimes the story of reform, and that's a part of this story. The fallen woman, she makes a bad decision, then she makes a better decision, and sort of how that's all kind of tied up neatly together. But if you look at the sort of promotions for the Hope Hampton character in A Modern Salome, there is this utilizing of a lot of these tropes. I mean, look at the poster on the right-hand side where the character, playing King Herod is made to look almost like Shylock, right? So again, this orientalizing, there's all of these sort of hidden cues that are always being placed in these images that don't come out of nowhere. They're drawing on a lot of these traditions. And if you read a lot of these ads for A Modern Salome, they almost start to sound like these early 20th century, almost sort of like Sunday school brochures. So again, Salome as a story for moralizing. And you see that, you see that in medieval texts too, but you start to see it more and more, and it's there in a lot of these film versions. Okay, the exact opposite of that, I would argue, is Alla Nazimova, Salome of 1923. If you don't know about the great Alla Nazimova, please do yourself a favor and spend some time with her. What an amazing human being. Russian Jew who came from a very highly educated family, migrated to the United States, knew Stanislavski, was lovers and very close friends with Eva Le Gallienne, very important in the history of American theater as well. Oddly enough, is also the godmother of Nancy Reagan, whose mother was good friends with her because Nancy Reagan's mother was very connected to the theater. So just really interesting woman. And she basically bankrupted herself making this movie. It cost, last time I read, I think the source said about $300,000 to $350,000 to create this. So she basically bankrupted herself making this, and then she couldn't really get a distributor for it. But the reason Salome from 1923 is so important is the queerness, the gayness, all of the perversity of Oscar Wilde's, the abjection, and then this incredible Art Nouveau style is all there to be seen on the surface. And the relationship between the young page boy of Herodias, who's in love with the Syrian captain, which is a homosexual love story, that is not hidden here. And the way that Salome plays, the way that Nazimova plays Salome, and she's in her 40s when she's playing this character as this evil teenager who's, sort of a crazy psychopath. I mean, it's no wonder she couldn't find a distributor for it. It's quite something. A few years ago, this incredible wig, which is covered in pearls on these sort of almost like black springs, was discovered in a trunk somewhere in the Midwest. And so I bring that up to show you because there are so many technical innovations, even in the way that costumes combine with the sets in this. So if you haven't seen it, please take the time. You can watch it on YouTube. It's absolutely delicious. And the posters, the promotional stuff for it, fully leaning in to the inspiration of Aubrey Beardsley and to the Art Nouveau becoming the Art Deco style. Really a bedrock, not only in the history of style in early cinema, but also in the queerness and the outsiderness of people really taking risks in the 1920s to put this story with all of its warts and all of its beauty and all of its strangeness right out there for everybody to see. It's a really, really important movie in the history of cinema, and in the history of feminism too, right? A couple of more images, one of these really weird page figures that surround her when she's taking off her clothes and getting ready to dance for the Seven Veils, that incredible cape where she's standing here looking down into the well, which looks like it also has like this wrought iron trellis. Really spectacular. Oh, by the way, the costumes were designed by Rudolph Valentino's wife, Natasha Rambova. One of the reasons this was also so expensive was because Natasha insisted that all of the fabrics be imported from Paris. So the story of sort of the decadence and the richness, even of the materials used, is a part of the story here. Well, we of course have to mention Sunset Boulevard from 1950 because the deranged star Norma Desmond, played by the incredible Gloria Swanson, who herself had been a vamp, following Theda Bara. Um, this is really important part of thinking about sort of the history of Hollywood and the history of the femme fatale. Well, I was racking my brain because I knew I'd seen this image of a young Gloria Swanson as Salome. And of course, as a fan of Sunset Boulevard, I knew that the character of Norma Desmond is obsessed with Salome, right? And that's, I'm sure you all know this film. The idea that Norma Desmond has is that this is going to be her vehicle to return to the screen after all these years. And of course, as the Bill Holden character points out, it's ridiculous for a woman in her 50s or who's 50 to be playing a teenage femme fatale, right? Uh, but oddly enough, that's exactly what Nazimova was doing, right? And she got it, and she did it. So, but anyway, back to this. Gloria Swanson did show up as Salome in 1925 in a comedic, slightly satirical film called 1925. So I've got that image from the silent era of Gloria Swanson holding the head of John the Baptist as Salome. So again, Billy Wilder, who made Sunset Boulevard, was from Weimar, Berlin. He was a part of this whole world. And so it's interesting if you think about Sunset Boulevard being made in 1950, people who were middle-aged or older, the vamp, the femme fatale of these early 1920 films was very, very much a part of their history. And that's certainly being poked fun at and thought through in 1950, 25 years later. So back to, that's sort of a reference to the Nazimova thing. I want to talk a little bit about the next film using the Salome story. A Western? Really? Yes, there's a Western called Salome Where She Danced, which is done in color and which launched the career of the late, great Yvonne de Carlo, you might know as Lily from the Munsters, but of course, who also had a wonderful Broadway career in Follies and many, many other films. And who herself was considered a great beauty on the screen in the 40s and 50s. The story is very strange. It's set during the American Civil War. She's this dancer from Prussia who comes over with this baron in exile. Very, very strange story, but quite fascinating to see how the story is being pulled into an American form, that of the Western. And of course, here she's appearing before all of these, horny cowboys out west, playing not so much the femme fatale as the sort of burlesque performer, right? The character is very, very empowered in this. I mean, it's a highly eroticized character, but she's also, the story is about her and about sort of her hard scrabble search to make a new life for herself in the Wild West. Well, in 1953, Rita Hayworth stars in an absolutely spectacular William Diderot directed version of Salome, which follows the Christian story pretty closely. However, Salome is not a villainess. Thinking back to Massenet's opera, which I talked about a little while ago, she is more than anything trying to survive. And it is Herodias and Herod who are, he's an old lech and Herodias is scheming. However, one of the other elements that is shown here that I think sort of casts, I don't want to say Herodias in a sympathetic light, but it helps us to allow her motivations. This is something I want to talk about when we talk about sort of the misogyny in this story. John the Baptist is calling for the death of Herodias because she has divorced her husband and married her brother-in-law. She's, and so if you think about it, a revolutionary agitator who is calling for the death of the queen, essentially, from the point of view of that queen, has to be stopped. And so, from Herodias's point of view, and also from Herod's point of view, which is, he's afraid to kill John the Baptist, there's a delicate dance that has to be performed, no pun intended, around what they do with John the Baptist. That set of motivations is fully explored in this film. It is also absolutely gorgeous in Technicolor with incredible, costume and set design, and the exquisite Rita Hayworth, who has never looked more beautiful, and is also a very, very sympathetic character. And there's also a love story with the very handsome Stuart Granger playing Claudius, a Roman soldier. And in keeping with the sort of Americanization of this, they both become Christians. I just wanted to show you this image of the great Charles Laughton as Herod and Judith Anderson as Herodias. Never, in my opinion, were the characters of Herod and Herodias more perfectly cast than these two, who just chew the scenery in the most glittering outfits. Absolute, just a camp thrill to watch them do these parts. And again, Granger and Hayworth are so beautiful as Claudius and Salome. But it ends happily. John, of course, dies, but Salome does escape with Claudius. It ends with the Sermon on the Mount. So again, in thinking about sort of the American Christian sort of visual culture of the time, you all of a sudden have left the exotic, erotic story of Salome, and you're in the middle of a Sunday school sort of illustrated primer. I mean, it works, but it's very, very American, and you truly do feel like you're in Sunday school. So Jesus giving his Sermon on the Mount, there's a beautiful matte shot. The camera pans into the crowd. And of course, in the center, our hero and heroine, and Salome is in white. So she's been removed from the space of the stripper into that of the good wife dressed in white. A totally opposite portrayal, which in many ways I feel is the most realistic way that Salome has ever been portrayed if you're thinking about the biblical story, is Bridget Baslin's portrayal of her in Nicholas Ray's King of Kings. The extraordinary and also sort of disturbing thing about this is she was 15 when she did this. Sadly, Bridget Baslin actually died at the age of 44. She was a young woman when she passed away, but this is really what she's most remembered for. And the way that she portrays this character is not as a victim. It's really as a child psychopath. I watched the clip from King of Kings. It goes on forever. It's 3 hours long, but it is incredibly disturbing and incredibly compelling. So if you haven't seen King of Kings, there's a lot of good stuff in it. But the whole story around Herod and Herodias and Salome and John the Baptist, I don't think the actor who plays John the Baptist is very good. But Bridget Baslin's portrayal is really, really fascinating. Another one of the other things that I want to point out when we're thinking about the character of Salome, all of the sort of attendant misogyny, all of the complications around, how old is this person? What kind of a situation is she in with her stepfather? Here's some more images of her from King of Kings. Frank Thring as Herod is so creepy. And Rita Gam as Herodias, also an incredibly beautiful actress. That's the other thing that I appreciated, because Herodias is very often this sort of wicked, almost like the evil queen from Snow White. Here she looks almost the same age as her daughter. I mean, she's a young, beautiful woman, and she's repelled by the fact that her husband is leaving her behind for her daughter. And there's a grotesqueness and and she's so disturbed by the fact that her husband is looking at her, teenage daughter in this way. You don't get that in a lot of the other versions, because the concern that Herodias has for what's occurring here. This is the only portrayal I've ever seen of Herodias as sort of a concerned mother. I mean, she also doesn't like John the Baptist, but so that was the other thing that I also found compelling about this portrayal of this twisted family. But another thing that I wanted to point out, again, if we're thinking about the complications and the strangeness of this character, particularly when we think about the fact that Salome, historically speaking, was probably a teenager, is who's got the agency here, right? So when Bridget was doing this role in 1961, the bad seed had come out in 1956, right? The murderous girl child. And then Lolita was to come out in 1962, right? So the exploration of this subject of the young, underage woman who's one, a murderer, or two, a seductress, or the character of Lolita is incredibly complicated, and it's such a creepy story. But what I would say is, because I think these two films are so close to this, I don't know if there's a connection, but that just popped into my mind when I was thinking through this particular portrayal of Salome being put on screen. One of the things that I also want to mention about this, and it's what I found most disturbing and also kind of liberating, is that so you have this teenage actress playing this character. She doesn't feel like a victim. In fact, she, in certain ways, feels very, very aggressive towards John the Baptist in a really violent way. And she gets exactly what she wants. And she also gets her mother exactly what her mother needs, the death of her major critic. And so I think one way to interpret this, setting aside just the creepiness and the strangeness of this family and what's actually occurring, is the fact that she portrays this character in a really empowered way. And it's also very, very disturbing. The iciness and the calculatedness of the way that she portrays this character. Really fascinating. So let's set that aside and let's talk about the way that Salome can be thought of. I've talked about the way that she has sort of been co-opted and utilized as a vehicle for sort of the sort of erotic female liberation on the stage, right? If you think about Maud Allan, Isadora Duncan, but also what about her queerness, and what about the way queer people, and particularly queer men, have used her? Obviously, Oscar Wilde is gay, queer, and he's the one who kind of invented this, or really got it going in a modern way. Well, there's a tradition also of Salome. There's a drag element of her. And there's a short film called Dance of the Seven Veils, which I have not seen. I haven't been able to find a copy of it, done in 1965, in which the drag pioneer Henry Arango, Cuban American, also an important queer rights activist, is filmed as Salome with the head of John the Baptist. And based on my research, Henry Arango actually would perform this as a part of his act. So you have somebody who's sort of a pioneer in the history of queer performance and drag in New York, using the Salome figure in their performance. There's a film that came out in 2020, which I haven't seen yet, called P.S. Burn This Letter, Please, in which a lot of these early queer performers and drag pioneers pre-Stonewall are interviewed. And so I can't wait to see it. I'm very excited. Here's an image of him in his 80s and an image of him in one of his spectacular outfits. So another thing that I want us to think through when we're thinking about the Salome story is the way that in performance, it can be used as also a liberating form, right? So the performer can take the story of Salome and use it in a way so that they can appear on stage in a disturbing, in a powerful, in a way that somehow puts a feminine force onto the stage that can trouble all of these things that we've been talking about, right? Because this is a really incredibly disturbing story, but the ambiguity of it can be sort of molded and twisted and utilized to put something on the stage that can be seen and witnessed in a new way, right? There is a strong tradition of that. And we start to see that really in the 50s and 60s. Here's one example of that. Um, the guy who played Herod in the 1961 King of Kings, is seen in that role again in a version that's done for Australian television, where a full performance of Oscar Wilde's Salome is actually done on TV. And because we're getting into the late 60s, there's a mod, a sort of dayglow element to it, even though it's done in black and white. So we'll see this sort of psychedelica of the 60s and the resurgent interest in Art Nouveau. Remember, that's an important part of the hippie movement and also the 60s style. you start to see that in these versions of Salome that are appearing in the 60s. But this is also another one of my favorite versions of Salome, only recently made available. It was made for French television in 1969, directed by Pierre Kralnik, and starring one of my favorite human beings, Ludmila Cherina, who was in her 40s when she did this, which is pretty amazing. Ludmila Cherina is a wonderful French Russian. She spent most of her time in France. She may even have been born in France, but she had Russian background. A great ballerina who appeared in a lot of the Powell Pressburger films. She's in The Red Shoes. She's in The Tales of Hoffmann. Oh, absolutely gorgeous, fabulous woman. Well, they do a production of Wild Salome in Park Güell in Barcelona, the fabulous Gaudi um, space. They light parts of it on fire. The outfits look like they're, from outer space. It's absolutely fabulous. And you can find this on YouTube. So I'd highly recommend it. So here's images of Park Güell in Barcelona, one of Gaudi's incredible masterpieces. And they use the underground parts of it, the upper parts of it, and it's incredible because parts of it are actually lit on fire. And then there's these massive veils when she does the Dance of the Seven Veils, um, which are like the size of circus tents that are used in the background. Absolutely fabulous. Very dark, very creepy, just marvelous. Had to point this out. This isn't an adaptation of Salome, but in the wonderful horror film from 1970, The House That Dripped Blood, Peter Cushing's character goes to this a wax museum and sees Salome with the head of John the Baptist, and then the trope. I guess I'm giving a little too much away here, but the head keeps changing, and the head that's on the platter, strangely enough, are gentlemen that he's been acquainted with. So again, because this image by 1970 is so well known and is so tied into the history of Western culture, it's sort of finding its way into like proto slasher films, right? So in thinking again about Dayglow and thinking about the swinging 60s, I just want to tell you about a couple of really psychedelic versions. For me, they're almost unwatchable because they're so long, but visually they're quite interesting. One is Carmelo Bane's Salome from 1972. The camera moves around a little bit too much for me. You feel like the director was really on something when he was shooting it, but stills are glorious. A lot of the characters are wearing mirrors on their faces, and there's tiles. And Bene, who was also an avant-garde stage director, is definitely drawing on the history of a lot of early 20th century art. It's visually spectacular, and you can definitely find it online. So if you're interested in experimental theater and in just fabulous, weird films from the 60s and 70s, do check it out. In 1974, there's a wonderful filmed version of the opera by Götz Friedrich, starring Teresa Stratas. You can also find this on YouTube, where the sets and the costumes are also drawing on a lot of the wonderful sort of mixture of new brutalism and minimalism in architecture, and also just some really wonderful weird costuming. So also really exciting and interesting. And then Teresa Stratas's performance as Salome of the Strauss opera is gorgeous. Check it out. Teo Hernandez, I can't remember if he was Mexican or South American. Sorry. A wonderful experimental filmmaker and visual artist, and also a gay, I believe. It takes the story and also, like Bene, does some really wonderful visual things with it, using veils and sequins and blossoms. So taking a lot of the visual tropes of the Salome story as it's come down to us and really exploding them into pure visuality. A few more images, the veils, the nets of gems, the scattered sequins, things like that. You really start to understand how if you look at this long history of Salome in its visual representations, remember I talked about style at the beginning of the lecture, you start to see all of the connections. You start to see how, my God, something lives in a culture for a century all of its elements are then borrowed and reinterpreted and utilized. And when we start to get to the middle of the 20th century, it's really exciting to see how avant-garde folks, queer folks, outsider folks really start taking these things and they start pulling them apart and they start using them for their own purposes. It's just really great. Getting back to the more sort of exploitive, erotic um, side of things, there's this very strange French, I think it's also an Italian production, very hard to find. 1986 production of Salome, which draws pretty heavily on Wilde, starring Joe Champa, who was a model and sort of an avant-garde bohemian celebrity in Europe at the time, but also she was well known as a model, and she goes completely naked. But there's sort of thinking about this being made in 1986. There's, shades of Red Sonja and Conan the Barbarian and all of these other sort of, sword and sandal things, cheesecake, beefcake things being done in the 80s that definitely also seep into this. And you certainly see that in the poster art, right? Looks like a sort of a Boris Vallejo illustration. There's Jo Champa under one of her veils. One of my favorites, can't recommend this enough, is Ken Russell, in my opinion, one of his best films, Salome's Last Dance, which was made in 1988, in which he basically took Wilde's play and he did something very interesting with it. He created a frame tale so that on the night that Oscar Wilde is arrested for gross indecency in 1895, Oscar is at a brothel, and the brothel keeper and all of the people who work in the brothel, and even an aristocrat who's a relative of Queen Victoria, who plays Herodias, Lady Alice, are performing Salome for him. And there's this wonderful back and forth between the actors and Oscar Wilde, and of course, Bosie, Wilde's lover, is playing John the Baptist. So this idea of the frame tale also becomes really interesting. It's very clever, very well done, and lots of cheeky references to the history of Salome and to Wilde's life. Can't recommend it enough visually. Oh, and it's also being performed on Guy Fawkes nights. You get this whole sort of masquerade element that comes into play. Really, really delicious. Stephen Burkoff took Wilde's play, did a fabulous stage adaptation, which is very minimal, drawing on sort of the Robert Wilson use of very stark lights. Something that's really incredible about this, because Wilde's text is so arcane and lapidary and heavy, what Burkoff does is he has the characters moving in slow motion for stretches of time. And what's so fascinating about that is there's this interesting juxtaposition between the use of Wilde's language and then the slow movements of the characters on stage. You can also, I think, find this on YouTube. And I know it's available on DVD. This is something I haven't seen. This is director Carlos Suara, who became very, very interested in documenting flamenco in Spain. He did a version of Salome in 2002, which, like the Ken Russell movie, utilizes the frame tale. So you have a group of flamenco dancers who are preparing for a performance using flamenco to tell the story of Salome. And it's both of those things. It's kind of a sort of a pseudo documentary of them preparing for this, and then it's also the actual performance. I've seen clips of it, absolutely ravishing and beautiful. Some images. Very strange version from 2003, which is an adaptation of the Wilde story set. It's Italian, and it has to do with the fall of a mob boss, and it's set in a warehouse. So again, so fascinating how people take this story and then they move it into different historical settings. Another really beautiful avant-garde filmed version of the opera is David McVicker's highly controversial production that was done in London with Nadja Michael. There's some nudity, male nudity. The executioner comes up out of the pit nude, covered in blood, and with overtones of sort of a 1930s sort of fascist government. Also available online or on DVD. Last but not least, Al Pacino became obsessed with the story, with the Oscar Wilde play, workshopped it, did various off-Broadway versions of it, and then filmed it as a documentary, his whole journey, playing Herod with Jessica Chastain is cast as Salome. And then they re-edited that documentary about that whole process and performance into just the performance of Wilde's play. Very, very mixed reviews. I'll be really honest with you. I can't get through it, just because I cannot buy him as Herod. I think it's also hard if you know the story and the exoticism of it. It's very difficult to hear Americans do it, and Americans very often have a very particular way of performing things that is just so different than the way Europeans very often perform them, or non-Americans, right? Oscar Wilde's play is not realistic. And so there, in my opinion, has to be something that moves you into the non-realistic space. So the weirdness of it can be more, it can be dropped into in a more easy way. That may just be my own prejudices, but that was my experience with it. Maybe I should give it another try. Last but not least, we're going to end here, I promise. Seven Veils. Wish I could see it. It was made in 2023. Adam Egoyan's new film starring Amanda Seyfried. I can't find it. I can't see that it's been released other than at the film festival circuit, getting great reviews. Egoyan directed Salome for the stage and then decided to take that experience and actually write a story about a woman director doing it. So he worked with Amanda Seyfried to create this character. And it is also about her personal story. And I don't know the details. They've kept it very, very quiet. But we know it has to do with her past. We know it has to do with female agency. We know it has to do with power. So the problematic story of Salome, and we've certainly explored the many elements of that in this lecture, based on what I've read, are being brought to the fore. So you have the story of a female director trying to do the Salome story, and her past is coming back to haunt her in some way. So very eager to see Seven Veils to find out what all of the hullabaloo is about. An image from it. There seemed to be a use of a lot of projections because it's a lot about trauma and memory, if I'm to believe what I'm reading online about it. And I want to end on this slide, because again, I think I mentioned to you that the name Salome, Shalom, Salam, means peace. The wonderful California pioneer of minimalist music, Terry Riley, created one of my favorite pieces of music. It's an epic string quartet that was recorded by the Kronos Quartet, and it is called Salome Dances for Peace. And Riley draws on a lot of different traditions around dance, Native American, Eastern, Levantine, and he brings them together to sort of create this sort of collage where Salome is thought of sort of in terms of being a goddess. And she is dancing, sort of doing a dance for the world in order to harmonize all of these warring elements. And it becomes a kind of a ritual to create peace, easy to find online. And I'll just say this, I was very privileged a few years ago to be in San Francisco for a live performance of this with Terry Riley in attendance. So I thought I really wanted to end this on a positive note and to just talk about, I think that the character of Salome is very empowering. I think she can be interpreted and has been interpreted in so many ways, but I also feel that she is a sort of a living entity. And I hope that the new generation of creators are going to take this story and they're going to explore different elements of it and use it to empower themselves and to empower this character. Thank you.
All right, Jason, thank you so much. I want to invite the audience. If anyone has any comments or questions, please put them either in the Q&A or the chat. Please excuse my voice too. I see it's dying here, but hopefully I can still make myself heard. Incredible tour de force as always, Jason. A list of films to watch, and yes, why can't we watch that film? I'm so excited to hear that. I never know how to say his name. Adam Egoyan did a version.
Yeah, I can't wait, but I
know.
can't
Let
wait.
me know if you find out anything about that.
Yeah.
Okay, so if anyone has any questions or comments, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. And in the meantime, I'll ask you, Jason, what inspired you to, I know you've been interested in Salome for a long time, but why
Yeah.
now did you feel this, do you feel this urge to kind of
Well,
consolidate all of this?
I'll tell you why, because I went back through sketchbooks that I kept when I was at Parsons, actually, School of Design, studying illustration in the late 90s. And I was obsessed with the ballet russe. And I was going through my sketchbooks and realized that in my late teens and early 20s, I was doing all of these drawings. I was obsessed with the Strauss opera. I was obsessed with the ballet russe. And I was like, oh my God, I was doing a lot of drawings of Salome. And then also, having been raised in the evangelical church, you know, I'm a student of mythology and I'm an academic historian, but the stories of the Bible have been poured into me my whole life, or were, and they're still very much a part of my DNA. And I just thought, in a way, Salome has been with me my whole life. She's sort of my sister.
Mm,
So why am I not thinking through,
mm,
like, where does she come from? Why do, who is this person? And obviously she's not one person, but so I think I sort of was shocked by how close I have been to Salome my whole life.
mm. Okay, so we have a comment from Amy Simon who says,
Yeah.
"Thank you so much. No questions, but a long list of movies, art, books, and music to look for."
Oh, thank you.
Asti says, "Thank you so much. I thought I knew a bit about Salome, but clearly I knew very little." Nolan,
Oh, thank you, Asti. That's very
hey,
sweet.
Nolan says, "Thank you so much. I really appreciate all the historical context surrounding the story before film. Between the imagery of the disembodied head here and from the robot lecture, I really enjoy how we come back to it."
A disembodied head. Boy, we can't get away from it, can we?
Well, that's great. Well, it seems like we don't have any questions, but everyone really enjoyed it, myself included. Oh, wait, we have one other comment. Let me check.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, John says, "If only this were the type of Sunday school lesson I endured growing up in the church."
Oh, John, I'm with you. But that's, here it is.
Oh, that's right. The Morbid Anatomy Sunday School.
That's
I
right.
have a question. She said, "Did Sarah Bernhardt end up playing Salome in
Oh,
Paris?"
I think she did, and I think it was in Paris, because have these photographs of her. But it's so funny you're asking that, because before the lecture, I actually went online and I was like, when did Sarah actually do this? I couldn't find the date, but I
Mm,
think she did perform it, and I believe it was in Paris.
great. Okay, well, I don't see any more questions. Thank you all for spending part of your Sunday with us. And Jason, thank you as always. I hope you will come to
Oh,
the
I
lecture
will.
class soon.
Such a pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Joanna.
Bye, everyone. Have a great weekend.